Okay, we should be back in live right now. So this is just kind of a confirmation that the channel is not dead. So we're just going to do a quick kind of stream proof of life as to this recent letter that Pope Francis published that LifeSite News and everyone else is freaking out about. This channel isn't really a political channel, so I don't assume this is going to be like a regular thing. I don't necessarily care about a lot of the scandals and Pope splaining or Pope criticizing or whatever that people do. I do have another stream on divorce and remarriage and the church fathers that I'm probably going to do at some point this week. I already have the research and stuff done. I just have to go through all my notes and refamiliarize myself with the topic because I've been indisposed the last 4 or 5 months with some military obligations and stuff like that. But now I'm back, and I can just basically do a stream like this really quick. I don't need to really prepare for it. I'm just going to riff this entire thing. So yeah, basically, as you can see from this LifeSite News thing, everyone's freaking out because Pope Francis is saying that we can't deport people or whatever, and Catholic conservatives are freaking out about that. Now, I'm not going to read the entire letter, though I did link it in the description, but I actually will go through a couple sentences of it, and I will go through this summary by Pope Respector on Twitter because I think that his summary of the document is relatively accurate. So he says that the document says as follows. First, it doesn't mention Trump. I think he's somewhat coping with that because he's right. If you do Control F and look up Trump or Vance, that's not going to come up. But it's very clearly a response to Trump's immigration policy. And then he says the next thing that the letter says is that it permits the removal of criminals. Quote, at the same time, one must recognize the right of a nation to defend itself and keep communities safe from those who have committed crimes, violent or serious crimes while in the country or prior to arrival. That's true. The document does say that. So criminal immigrants can be deported, and that's basically what Trump is doing anyway. So I don't know why he's thinking that Trump is being much more based than he is. Probably just because his information gets filtered through the mainstream media in Italy or whatever. And then he says, C, that it permits a border policy. So, quote, this does not impede the development of a policy that regulates orderly and legal migration. So that's also true. That is also present in the document. But one of the things that I find in this document that's kind of interesting is that C and B, in his other opinions, kind of contradict each other. So in paragraph 4, he says, for example, that the act of deporting people who have left their own land for reasons of extreme poverty, insecurity, exploitation, persecution, or serious deterioration of the environment damages the dignity of men and women, of entire families, and places them in a state of particular vulnerability and defenselessness. So the Pope is basically coming out saying that if someone has entered your country for one of these reasons, they shouldn't be deported merely by the fact that they entered illegally. Now, they can be deported if they commit another violent crime, a murder, or rape, or robbery. That he would be fine with. But merely the case of illegal entry, he seems to preclude that as a reason to deport an individual, if that's the only reason. But in my opinion, that somewhat is contradictory to what he's saying, where this does not impede the development of a policy that regulates orderly and legal migration. And the reason that's contradictory is that having a immigration policy where you only get deported if you commit a violent crime implies that you basically have open borders unless you're a criminal. But that itself would be contrary to orderly and legal immigration system. And in fact, the USCCB, for example, has even come out and said that they condemn an open border policy. So in my opinion here, the Pope's position isn't really well thought out. I think he's well intentioned. And I think that the principles with which he is applying are all true. All the principles he is trying to apply are true, but the way he's applying them, I don't think is actually very coherent. So that's the first thing I would say. I disagree with the Pope on in terms of applying these principles. I don't obviously reject any of these principles that he is putting forth. So that's the first thing I would say, that I think that the Pope's views are somewhat contradictory, not very coherent. And that makes sense. I mean, he's the Pope. He's trained in making these principles correct, but he's not necessarily trained in the application in terms of public policy because he's not trained in that. So that's the first thing I would say when it comes to this writing. The second thing I would like to point out is that he's against the act of deporting people who come for these various reasons. And I don't think that it would actually be contrary to Catholic teaching to deport individuals merely due to the fact that they entered illegally. And for that, I would pull up CCC, so this is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2241. So I'm going to pull that on screen here. I do have it linked below, but I'm just doing it on this Word document because it allows me to highlight and bold and format however I want. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger here so that you guys can read it. Why isn't it getting bigger? Let me see if I can. There we go. Okay, so the first part of the paragraph is this. More prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and means of livelihood which they cannot find in their country of origin. Public authority should see to it that the natural right is respected that places a guest under the protection of those who receive him. So one of the things that's kind of been common in Catholic social teaching in the 20th century is the right to immigrate, which obviously implies a certain right to immigrate. And this makes sense because in the context of the 20th century, you had communism. Communism is contrary to church teaching. It had taken over, more than half the world's population, and people understandably were trying to leave those situations to enter a better one. Now, one of the things I would like to point out is, so the more prosperous nations are obliged to, welcome a foreigner. That would make sense maybe if you're talking about an extremely poor nation where people are starving to death, but that's not actually the case with American immigration, even illegal immigration. I mean, Mexico is a growing nation. It has a burgeoning middle class. Most people in Mexico aren't starving, and if they are starving, they can merely move to a different part of Mexico in order to get the opportunities they need to survive. So to the extent that we're, obliged to import foreigners into our country to benefit them, the question is, okay, that may be true, but should we have open borders with, say, Eastern Europe? Because Eastern Europe's poorer than the United States. The average GDP in Ukraine before the war in Ukraine was about the same as, American blacks, which is poorer than average, white people in the United States. So why don't we just import everyone from Ukraine into the United States? Because they'll probably end up, being, average white income. They'd do better off if we did that. So I think that there's some nuance that can be added to this that the church magisterium hasn't necessarily addressed directly and that the Pope doesn't consider in his letter. The second thing I would like to highlight here is that it says, to the extent they are able. And the question is, what does that mean? So does immigration need to be at the level where the United States is collapsing for us to restrict immigration? I don't think that is a standard that is very consistent. I don't think that's a standard that could even be applied to the United States. And one of the things I would like to point out is that high levels of migration, both legal and illegal, will, over time, change the extent we are able to even help poor individuals, because immigration has been shown in various research to impact the economic trajectory of nations. So I'm just going to bring up a book really quick here called The Culture Transplant. We're not going to read through it. It was published by economist Garrett Jones at George Mason University. It was published by Stanford, so this isn't just, some, right-wing bigoted screed or whatever. But he basically goes through the academic research and finds that immigrants bring their institutions, they bring their culture, and they bring their politics with them. So, unsurprisingly, if you change the composition of the United States, you're going to change our institutions, our politics, our culture, etc. And the problem with that is, the reason the United States is so desirable to live in the first place is because of all those aforementioned things. The politics, the institutions, and the people. Okay? So if you change the people, you're going to change the underlying structures and make it so that we cannot help people anymore to begin with. Another thing I would like to point out is, even assuming that wasn't the case, even assuming our institutions stayed exactly the same, well, that's still problematic because our institutions are set up in a way that the lowest quintiles of individuals up through the middle are net recipients in the United States when it comes to things like social services. And unsurprisingly, if you're in the top 20% of households, you're basically funding everyone else. And if you're in this fourth quintile, you're basically just breaking net even. Now, you might say, well, that makes sense. And I agree that makes sense. We should have a system, because if a system wasn't set up like that, it'd be a problem. Catholic social teaching is all about helping the poor. But the problem with this is that the United States is running super high deficits. So our immigration policy should be biased not towards people who are going to make these deficits worse over time, but rather be biased towards people who will make the system more solvent, because that makes it us able to better care for the poor people already in this country. So once again, I think this is another level of nuance that the Pope hasn't considered, and which, I think should be factored into his analysis. Another thing I'd like to point out is the second half of this paragraph. So it says that political authorities actually have a right to exercise various juridical conditions to immigration. What does that mean? I personally think that that would include having a cap as to the number of individuals who come in. I think that's a totally fair, policy to have. I think that even the Pope, if you were to say, hey, should there be a cap on the number of people who enter in legally, he'd probably say yes. There may be a dispute as to what that cap should be, but it should exist. And once you make that admission already, you're already going to necessarily, first, you're going to have to deport people that enter illegally because there's going to be people coming in because they can't get in because of the cap. And two, you're going to have to be making decisions as to what type of people you are admitting once you have this cap, because you can't let in everyone. So that right there is going to further complicate this. This isn't really pointed out in the Holy Father's letter, and I think it's something that would need to be accounted for if you were actually trying to make a coherent reply to American immigration policy. And then he goes on to say that, the Catechism goes on to say that immigrants have certain duties towards their country of adoption. And remember, the Pope is against deporting individuals who have merely entered this country illegally and haven't committed any other crime. But the problem for that is that because it also notes that they need to obey its laws, well, the first act of these individuals is to enter the United States illegally and to break our laws and to, therefore, not uphold their duties toward the country of adoption. So their first act as an immigrant, by being an illegal immigrant, is to basically not respect with gratitude the material, spiritual, and legal heritage of the country and to break the law. So in my opinion, based on the Catechism itself, you should be able to deport illegal immigrants whose sole crime is illegal entry. That is something I don't think the Pope considered in his letter, and is something that I hope that he will eventually revisit and be able to better harmonize these things. And the last thing I would like to comment on is he does comment on the whole Ordo Amoris controversy, because that's something that J.D. Vance brought up when they were asking how could he as a Christian say that he's America first and whatnot. And he says that the true Ordo Amoris is, to meditate on the idea of the Good Samaritan and basically to love everyone equally. Now, that's somewhat of a, exaggeration. He doesn't say that directly. But he's essentially, and we'll get into what, I think I know what he's referring to, and I think that there's actually a truth to it. But I'm going to get into what an Ordo Amoris is. So he's saying that first we need to focus on the Good Samaritan. That's actually what a lot of progressives were saying on Twitter as well, and saying, hey, look, obviously when it comes to love, the Christian message isn't only to love your family, close kin, and, other people in your nationality, such as, other American citizens, but you need to love everyone just like the Good Samaritan. And that's true. That is a revolutionary message of Christianity and Catholicism. But one of the things I would point out with that is, first, no one would disagree that you need to love everyone by virtue of being human. That is a very Christian idea. And I'm glad that the Pope is emphasizing that, because there probably are a certain number of people in the United States who look at immigration and don't take that into account. But I don't think that's what J.D. Vance was saying. He was merely saying that we have greater duties towards individuals who are closer to us rather than individuals who are further away. I think that's true. I think that's Catholic. I think that's embedded in Catholic philosophy. And in fact, Thomas Aquinas has essentially an entire part of his Summa dedicated to this. Question 26, the Order of Charity. Again, it's linked below. And let's go back to this Word document here, because I also have some parts highlighted I want to go through here. So Thomas Aquinas says, it is more grievous a sin to act against the love of certain neighbors than it is to act against the love of others. Hence the commandment, Leviticus 29. So this is an error in New Advent. He's talking about Leviticus chapter 20. But he that curseth his father or mother, dying, let him die. So there's a stricter punishment for going against charity against your parents than other individuals, which makes sense. Respect your father and mother is in the Ten Commandments. So clearly that is a step above, sins against charity towards other individuals. So that would therefore imply that you can love your parents and have greater duties towards your parents than other individuals. And, that's basically all J.D. Vance is saying, that he has a greater duty to his wife by virtue of the fact that they're married and are in a conjugal union and have been made one flesh. He has a greater duty to his children than the children of others because they are an extension of him. And he has a greater duty to his friends and his countrymen by virtue of the fact that they are geographically and spiritually closer to him. And in fact, this is actually something that Aquinas points out. So we love all men equally, and this is what the Pope's talking about, out of charity, because we wish them all one same generic good, namely everlasting happiness. True, 100% I agree with Pope Francis here. But what Pope Francis seems to not be emphasizing for whatever reason is that we can love others through another sense, which is that of being more intense. And in that way, we ought not to love all equally, okay? So in some generic sense, yes, we need to love all equally, but we still have a duty to love some more than others in terms of intensity. Well, why? Well, he talks about this later in Article 7. He says, some neighbors are connected to us by their natural origin, and some aren't. So we're going to be have more of a duty to a neighbor who lives next door to us than one who lives 2 streets down, which makes sense. And we're going to have more of a duty to our fellow American citizen, a fellow American poor individual, than a foreign poor individual. That does not mean we don't have duties to the foreign poor, but it does mean that we do have duties to American poor first. And in fact, the American poor economically are the ones who are harmed most by immigration anyway, because it is those individuals with whom the immigrants are going to be competing against when it comes to jobs, when it comes to wages, etc., and so forth. In fact, the research I've seen shows that the people harmed most by immigration are recent immigrants, are legal immigrants. And obviously, everyone knows that big businesses try to use immigrants to reduce the wages of the American poor and the American working class. So clearly, that right there is something that the Pope I don't think is factoring in. And if the Pope was aware of it, I think he would actually have a big problem with it, given his screeds against income inequality and the abuse of big business and overly free market systems and stuff like that. So I actually think that the Pope could, if he was given the right information, be holding these views, and he would be using the same exact principles, because he and I are working on the same plane, but we're just simply applying them in different manners. And in my view is my position on the topic is more consistent than the Holy Father's on immigration. Again, he's right and fully in his authority to try to correct people who he feels as though are going against human dignity. But I feel as though he's just not working with all the information. And if I'm proven wrong on that, maybe I'll change my opinion. But I think that these are all points that should be brought forward, and that I don't think it's against Catholic social teaching for a Catholic to be an immigration restrictionist, that is, support low levels of immigration rather than high levels of immigration, as evidenced by the Catechism, as evidenced by the concept of Ordo Amoris in the writings of Thomas Aquinas. And again, there's nothing in this letter that changes Catholic social teaching. It is merely an attempt to try to go after certain excesses, and maybe there's some merit in that. But overall, I think that American immigration policy is actually exceedingly generous. Now, one thing I think that should also be pointed out is maybe you can make an argument that the United States has a certain duty to provide foreign aid to poor individuals. I think you could actually make that argument pretty well, that would also help fulfill America's duty to help the foreign poor without importing them, because if we imported all of them, we would simply cease to exist and wouldn't be able to help anyone, period. Now, a lot of people say, well, didn't Trump pause foreign aid? Well, he did. And I think that's a good thing, because the foreign aid as it currently existed was promoting a lot of anti-Catholic causes. We were funding contraception, we were funding abortion, we were funding LGBT initiatives, which are contrary to Catholic social teaching. So I think that the Trump administration's goal to pause it, get rid of all the waste, and then on a case-by-case basis begin doling that stuff out, I think that's fair. So once again, I have a feeling that I don't really personally feel as though that the current administration's immigration policies are against Catholic social teaching. I don't think they actually contradict any of the principles that the Pope lays out here. And that I think the Pope, if he was given certain information, would see the same thing and would have written this letter a little bit differently. But yeah, so that's basically the end of this stream. I'll be coming back hopefully later this week with a topic that I've been working on, the whole divorce and